do know that President Trump plans to proceed very quickly. He said he expected to meet with Vladimir Putin in Saudi Arabia in the relatively near future, and seems to have pretty explicit ideas. I mean, his defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, earlier in the day basically laid out the U.S. position, seemed to take NATO membership for Ukraine off the table and concede that Ukraine's not going to get all of its land back. And he also said the U.S. would not commit troops. So the U.S. is beginning to roll out the sort of vague form of a Ukraine policy position. And the key thing here really is that they are essentially saying this is going to be a U.S.-Russia conversation. That's a big shift from the Biden administration, where they said, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. They wanted Ukraine to be at the center of these, because this was obviously Ukraine that got invaded. So we're seeing a lot of big shifts. He's showing very explicitly he wants to move fast, but no timeline yet.
All right, where does President Zelensky fit into this? My understanding is that he also talked with President Trump.
Yes, so they talked after the Trump-Putin call, which, really as a symbolic gesture, it's difficult to overstate how big a deal that is, that President Biden had refused to do that conversation. So Trump speaking with Putin, he then did talk to President Zelensky, who's playing it pretty cautiously. He said he had a good conversation with President Trump and looks forward to working with the U.S. president. And Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is in Ukraine right now. They're trying to do an economic partnership deal. And what you're seeing there is essentially the U.S. looking to secure Ukrainian mineral resources in exchange for sending more aid to Ukraine. So you're seeing just a big shift. This is not going to be a freebie, and Trump's making that very clear.
What did you make of the numbers that the president threw around? $350 billion, I believe, is what he said as far as U.S. aid provided to Ukraine. But he alluded to, yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean, that is not the number we understand is significantly lower. It's not. There's military aid, there's humanitarian assistance, there's aid that's meant to help with corruption. So it's unclear to me exactly. We still need to run the numbers on where President Trump got those numbers. But in terms of the actual economic aid to help Ukraine's military, that's pretty exaggerated.
How do you read the tea leaves? Because this is happening, this phone call, right after we saw the release of Mark Vogel, who was in a Russian prison, an American teacher. And I'm just curious, kind of the optics of what we are seeing and how this is unfolding.
Well, I mean, the optics are just a huge shift. So the U.S. had pushed to do prisoner swaps with Russia, but you'd never seen a situation where a U.S. envoy, in that case, Steve Witkoff, who is nominally Trump's envoy for the Middle East, he went to Moscow, reportedly met with Vladimir Putin, came back with Mark Vogel on the plane. You also had another deal where an American was released from Belarus, a U.S. ally. So what you're seeing is essentially the jump starting of a flurry of contacts between the U.S. and Russia. That's something that we really had not seen in the last several years. There had been those exchanges, but they had always been done through intermediaries. So I think this is something that Trump had made clear, and there was no secret he was going to do this, just have much closer contact with Vladimir Putin. The argument, the criticism is that amounts to a win for the Russian president. He had been isolated from the U.S. and the allies, and U.S. allies very much still wanted to keep that approach. Trump basically doing this without warning, some indication he gave no heads up to European officials about either of those deals, so they were very much caught off guard.